Thank you very much. Yes, as we've known over the last weeks, a lot has been said about the undecideds. And we had a talk about undecideds in January. And a lot of people said, well, but what is going to really happen with the campaigns? Are they going to be moved? And here's the chance to look into some of those issues. The question effectively is, who is still wavering? We've seen there are some people, but we want to see what happens also in relation to turnout, because we know polls and surveys include ideally nearly everyone, but what matters is obviously who's actually showing up on the day. And what also matters, and Lindsay will be talking about this, something that's not very often looked at. We look sometimes at socio-demographic profiles, but we don't engage with the issue with education, but make a lot of assumptions about people. So we're going to talk about these two issues now. I'll start with the bit about characterizing those who might still be wavering in one way or another. The key thing is they matter. Sometimes it's been suggested when we talked about this in January, people say, well, the people who don't know, they just don't care. As we've shown then already, that's not true. And it's particularly not true if a lot of people vote. And therefore, we start by looking at the voting likelihood. Now, we have an 11-point scale, goes from 0 to 10 in the Scottish Social Attitude Survey. And as you can see, the percentage of those that say they are effectively very likely to vote, that give it a 10, basically, we might want to call that are certain to vote, that's 3/4 of the survey respondents. Now, that's a lot. I mean, you know probably what kind of Scottish Parliament elections get about 50% turnout, UK elections maybe over 60. It's that it looks like a lot. If we expand this and say who's actually likely to vote, who has a higher likelihood of voting than not voting, then we get figures that go close to the 90. Now that doesn't mean everyone votes, obviously, who's in this, but it clearly, if we compare that to any other election, that is very, very high, not only by British standards. If we break that then down into the different groups, you see on the left-hand side, the 2013, and the right-hand side, 2014, and looking here at those who say they vote yes, those who vote no, and those who say they are currently undecided in this wide spectrum that John talked about earlier, what we do see is that likelihood of voting has gone up in all of these groups. It's not that it's only gone up amongst yes or no voters, but crucially for this talk, it has gone up also amongst the undecideds. Over 80% of the undecideds are in the likely to vote group, actually. So that's a lot. I could show you the figures for certain to vote, and it's all a bit lower in all groups, but also has gone up in all of these groups. So it's not that we're looking at undecideds, who by and large are people who don't care. That's a very small proportion thereof. If we focus on those undecideds in the wider spectrum, then we have those who have a leaning to yes, a leaning to no, as John said earlier, and those who genuinely say no idea. That was, I think, 12% overall left. That's, that genuinely have no idea at all. But this is the wide spectrum of them. What we see then is the pattern from 2013 is pretty much replicated. Amongst those who say they have not completely made up their mind but are leaning towards yes, they have a somewhat higher likelihood of voting than those leaning towards no, who have not completely made up their mind. But again, voting likelihood has gone up throughout in all of these groups. Even amongst those who here say don't know, they're the ones that have the highest likelihood of having some disinterested people in. But even there, that is a small group. That's a really small group here as well. And obviously we can combine this, so this is including those who outright say yes or no, and those who have kind of an inclination to say yes or no, and these are the remaining 12% undecideds. And again, it has gone up in all of these groups. Now, if we take that as our basis, similarly as taking it for the referendum vote, and look at likelihood to vote and weight their yes and no votes, so basically if someone gives it a 10, then their vote is counted, 100% full vote. If someone says 0 on likelihood to vote, then we discount their voting intention, basically. So we weight them accordingly. Then we see something that has been shown by quite a few of the polls in different ways that we've shown in January, with only a slight change compared to 2013, is that the yes side has a slight advantage in voting turnout. And if we use this weighting, it would make a 2% difference. So there would be a small difference, but obviously not one big enough to close the gap that we're measuring in the survey. But it is important to remember that voting turnout matters. The actual result on voting day is obviously a function of voting intention and voting turnout. So there is a little bit happening there, but it's not massive. Turnout has gone up in all groups. Now, okay, so the undecideds matter. That's very important. Most of them intend to vote on the referendum day. So let's engage with them a bit more. I focus here on the characteristics that we found to matter most already in 2013 to see whether anything has changed on these characteristics. Other things like age, social class did not matter very much in determining the undecideds. We know that women have a slightly higher likelihood of being undecided, but I won't say much more because obviously there's a full talk by Rachel this afternoon on this. Amongst party affiliation, we know that most conservatives have made up their mind, and I probably don't have to tell you in which direction. But Labour and SNP voters are the ones, or affiliates, people who feel close to either of these parties, not necessarily voters, they are the ones with the highest likelihood of undecideds. And before you start writing big headlines about the Liberal Democrats, the sample proportion of Liberal Democrat supporters is very small. And therefore, these changes are not necessarily reliable. So it's not necessarily a 10% increase in indecision amongst the Liberal Democrats. We have large margins of error there. What is quite interesting is on the far right-hand side is those who do not affiliate with any political party. Still, that is the group with the highest likelihood of indecision regarding party affiliation. But even there, it has gone down quite a lot. So the majority of people that does not affiliate themselves with any political party is now in the likely to vote group. So it's not that kind of non-party affiliates don't matter. Actually, the gap has narrowed a tiny bit. Political interest story is relatively similar to January, although look at the left-hand side. Those who say they have quite a lot of interest have reduced their indecision effectively, substantially. But the crucial message, again, is indecision has gone down in all groups. There is a relationship with political interest, so those who have no interest at all are less likely to vote than those with a lot of political interest. So there is a little bit of that in there, but it's a relatively small group. Knowledge perception, that's people, their knowledge of independence. As you've seen, very few that say a great deal or no knowledge at all. Not much has changed. In all groups, the indecision likelihood has gone down a bit. And whether it makes a difference to your own life, again, in all groups, the indecision has gone down a bit. There are very few people that say it has no effect at all, so probably not so important, that group. Okay, so there's something about the demographic characteristics, general attitudes, but that doesn't tell us that much. Those are things that we effectively knew with a few changes. Effectively, nearly everyone is more likely to make up their mind in this. We've seen nearly everyone is more likely to vote as well. So what are some of the core things that could matter? One thing we've looked at last year as well were the actual constitutional preferences. And here there's an option for a few years that has been included in the Scottish Social Attitude Survey that allows people to basically indicate that they favour further devolution. So the first option, Scottish Parliament should make all decisions for Scotland, is effectively independence without using the word independence. It's this idea about how the constitutional arrangement should be. The second one is that the UK government should make decisions about defence, foreign affairs, Scottish Parliament about everything else, in a sense, further devolution apart from foreign affairs. The other one, the status quo, and obviously the reversal of devolution. And what's crucial to see here is that the number of those, in line with what John has shown also on some of the older long-standing question, that those who say the Scottish Parliament should make all decisions for Scotland has risen quite substantially, actually. So if it's not kind of asking, do you vote for independence or not, we actually have a bit of a rise in this group. So that might be an interesting group to look at. The key thing is the makeup of this group, although it is now a bigger group, people who say the Scottish Parliament should make all decisions for Scotland, 40% say that, the makeup of this group has hardly changed at all. So 56% of that group indicate that they would vote yes, 12% no, 33% undecided in the wide spectrum of indecision. So some of them have a leaning, however, towards yes or no. Most of them have a leaning. But the crucial thing is there's a substantial group of people who says the Scottish Parliament should make all decisions, but they are in the indecision spectrum. And that's actually, if I take the no's and undecideds together, regardless of the leaning, then that's 17% of all respondents. So that seems to be potentially a group that would be worth engaging with. Now, here's the key issue, though. Why is there a group that is less likely to basically vote yes, to act on their idea that the Scottish Parliament deciding everything is their ideal? The reason is, and here we're unfortunately, again, with something that will not sound new to you, especially if you were here from the beginning of today, It's the economic question once again. Those people, so this is just those people who say the Scottish Parliament should decide everything. So I'm focusing on that group, those 40%. And we split them into the yes supporters and those who say they either vote no or they're in the indecision spectrum. And if you look at them, you very clearly say those who vote yes are largely convinced that the economy would be better. Those who are in the no or indecision spectrum are much more dubious about the consequences of independence. So in a sense, yes, this is a substantial group that we can identify with regards to there are a lot of undecideds in this group. They are actually sympathetic to the idea of an independent Scotland, but the reason why they don't act upon it largely is the general story again, that they need to be convinced that Scotland's economy would be better in order to act on this. So do they need special engagement? Maybe not, if that general economic message is the core. Finally, last point from me before I hand over to Lindsay. In January, we said a group that was very important were the people who were actually favoring devolution max, or further devolution, or whatever you want to call it. Now, the proportions are similar, so it's just under a third of people that favor that idea, for whom that is their preferred constitutional arrangement in that sense, if we use this measure. And there is a substantial proportion of people who fall in our indecision spectrum amongst those who we might term maximum devolutionists. It's about a third of them, as said. However, that number has dropped compared to 2013. So there is a substantial group amongst those who favor further devolution that is still undecided, but it's fewer than in 2013. So there are more people amongst the maximum devolutionists who have made up their mind, it seems. Which direction have they gone? Nearly exclusively, it seems, in the aggregate, we obviously don't know what individuals do, but in the aggregate, the large benefactor seems to be no. So amongst people, we have a rise in those who favor maximum devolution that intend to vote no compared to 2013, when there was a much larger group of the undecideds, while no rise in yes. So it seems to suggest that those people who have moved away from indecision, within those people who favor maximum devolution, they largely shifted to no. So this suggests that there, some of the discussions about further devolution packages in the event of a no vote by the Better Together campaign and the related parties might have had some effect. But now I hand over to Lindsay, because a lot of these findings actually should be read with a further qualifying variable, and that's education.
Thank you, Jan. As Jan and John have both said, the question of education in relation to this referendum has barely been debated. And so our question now is whether that's right, whether education does have something to tell us about why people are voting or not voting or intending to vote in the way that they intend to do. I'm going to make 3 points. One is about a long-term shift in the views of people with different amounts of education. The second point is a signal success for the no campaign related to matters concerning education. And the third and last point will be a potential success for the yes campaign if it agrees what we're about to recommend to them that they do. So first of all, though, what are the patterns of education? Now, this just goes back to 2010. The blue bits are people with university qualifications. The red bit are people whose maximum attainment is upper secondary school, Highers and A-levels. The grey bit is people whose maximum attainment is standard grades, middle secondary. And the yellow or orange bit is the people who have no formal qualifications at all. And I'll be using that fourfold classification throughout this part of the talk. And of course, one of the striking things, as in all developed societies at the moment, is that really quite a large revolution has taken place. If we took this back to the 70s, it would look even more striking. Some 40% of the population now have some kind of higher education qualification, the blue bit, and a total of nearly 2/3, just over 60%, have at least an upper secondary qualification. And so the question, first of all, is does education matter? And one of the things we can say if we compare the blue bars here, which are 2013, the percentage intending to vote yes, and the red bars, which are 2014, those intending to vote no, according to the 4 groups, so the 4 education levels with higher education at the left, is that education matters less in 2014 than it did in 2013. There's quite a lot of differentiation in the yes intentions a year ago, but by the spring and summer of this year, you can see almost exactly the same. Just around 1/4 of people, of the whole sample, in each of these education groups intending to vote yes. So you would say here, perhaps, that there isn't much relevance of education at all. However, instead of looking at it in terms of the intention for the 18th of September, I now want to look at it in terms of the other measure which Jan outlined, which is the long-running question that doesn't use the word independence, but looks at the question of people who would prefer full powers for the Scottish Parliament. So if you like, this is people's ideal, unmixed with the furore of the election campaign. And this looks over 4 years. Within each of these, 5 years. Within each of these 5 years, there are the 4 bars corresponding to the different levels of education, with again, blue being higher education and yellow being people with no qualifications at all. And the key message from this is that although there is a gradient in all years, this is in relation to preferring full powers. It is the case always in these 5 years that the people who have higher education are less likely to prefer full powers for the Scottish Parliament than those with no qualifications. That gradient has become quite substantially weaker in 2014 compared with 2010. If you drew a line across the tops of these sets of 4 bars, it would be gradually flattening out. So that the differences between the different education categories in 2014 are quite a lot less, actually, than the differences that there were as recently as 2010. Now, what's more, if you then look at the second of the options on that question that Jan explained earlier on, which was maximal devolution, there is a gradient in the opposite direction, which I've not shown here. The people with university degrees, etc., are far more likely to prefer maximal devolution as their preferred constitutional option than those with no qualifications at all. So if you put these two together and ask what percentage of people would like the Parliament to have more powers than at present, and do it again for these 5 years according to the 4 levels of education, you can see the pattern on the next slide. If you look at 2014 there, you can now see that the blue bar is the highest bar of all. In short, by now, we have a situation in which the people with the highest amounts of education are those who are most enthusiastic for strengthening the powers of the Scottish Parliament, and the yellow bar in 2014, those with the least amount of education, are the people least enthusiastic for strengthening the powers of the Scottish Parliament. So putting that together is full powers for the Parliament or maximal devolution. Now that's a change compared, for example, with 2010, which was by and large the other way round, but it's actually a change going far further back. You can go right back, not just to the Scottish Social Attitude Survey beginning of 1999, you can go back through the Scottish Election Surveys of 97, of 92, you can go back even to the Scottish Election Survey of 1979, when some of us were just out of childhood, and you can find that this has never ever been the case before. It has always previously been the case. Even though higher education has expanded enormously in that time and everything else has changed, it has always been the case until this year, and to some extent 2013 if you look at it closely, that the higher educated have been less enthusiastic about more Scottish autonomy. That's, if you like, been one of the premises of the entire modern campaign for Scottish self-government, that it's about the oppressed struggling against the Scottish elites. The evidence of this is that that's somewhat changed. Now, you can do this also in terms of social class. The gradients are less clear, but by and large, you're getting the same kind of message. It is no longer the case that the most enthusiastic support for more powers for Scottish autonomy are amongst the least privileged groups of society. So that's my first tipping point. It's a long-term tipping point. It's probably got nothing to do, maybe, with the present campaign. It's a change that has gradually come about and is, I think, a change of fundamental importance for the very self-definition of the Scottish self-government movement. Secondly, I'm now going to look at education and the undecideds. You might expect a well-educated electorate to take longer to make up its minds. That's what we teach people in seminar rooms every day, this 40% of people who have higher education qualifications. And indeed, this does seem to be the case. The blue bars, again, we're back to referendum vote rather than ideal outcome. The blue bars are 2013, the intention to, those who are undecided in 2013. The red bars are those who are undecided in 2014. And you can see there's been, at the right-hand end here, a big drop in the proportion of undecideds amongst those with no formal qualifications, from 40% a year ago down to 28% now. By and large, there's no difference between the education categories in 2014, but the key thing is that there has been no change for those with a higher education qualification. They are still ruminating. They are still coming to events like this, for example. They're still listening to Radio 4 and wondering what on earth to make of this whole debate. So that's a key effect of education in the sense that it's effect of not having changed things. But this is even more clearly the case if we confine our attention to that key swing group that Jana pointed out, which is the supporters of maximal devolution. I mentioned them a minute ago. The percentage undecided there has fallen particularly markedly amongst those with low or minimal qualifications. Again, look at the right-hand end of this graph. Blue again is 2013, red is 2014. Those with no formal qualifications and who are maximal devolutionists went from 44% to 19% undecided in the past year. Similar kind of fall for those with lower secondary. There was a fall for those even with higher education, unlike the previous slide, but the fall has been much less, and it still leaves amongst them, and indeed amongst those whose highest qualification is upper secondary education, around 40%, around 4 out of 10 people, maximal devolutionists with quite a lot of education, still undecided about what to do. Now, we've seen before, both from John and in detail from Jan, that the maximal devolutionists on the whole, as a group as a whole, have shifted predominantly towards no. But what is particularly the case is that the maximal devolutionists with low education have shifted towards no. Quite a complicated one here. Again, the 4 blocks now are the 4 education categories. If you compare, just to focus in here, the yellow bars are the bars which are the no percentages for 2014, and the grey bars are the no percentages for 2013. And look at the right-hand end again. In 2013, those with no formal qualifications had 52% intending to vote no. These are people who favour maximal devolution. That had risen to 67%, a very big rise. Next group up, those with lower secondary education. So these are lower secondary educated people who favour maximal devolution, a rise in the no percentage from 51 to 71. Now, there have been rises in the no percentages for the better educated groups, but the proportionate rise is less. The key shift then, the key reason why the maximal devolutionists as a whole have moved towards no is particularly the less well-educated groups within the maximal devolutionist group. So that's the second tipping point, and I think is a signal success of the no campaign. The no campaign have captured the overwhelming support of maximal devolutionists with minimal education. And we might want to speculate as to why that was the case. Now to my final point. When they do make up their minds, the well-educated tend to make up their minds in more definite directions. So, for example, here's the question that we've seen many times already today, and we'll hear about it more this afternoon, which is whether independence would benefit the economy, make no difference, or harm the economy of Scotland. And this is the percentages saying that it would make no difference amongst the different education categories. At the left-hand side is 2013, at the right-hand side is 2014. And basically the point is here that the gradient is from left up to right within each of the 2 years. In other words, when people with a higher education qualification do make up their minds, they're less likely to prevaricate. They're less likely to say that it will make no difference. They come down firmly on one side or the other. Now, the problem, of course, for the Yes campaign is that, by and large, on this same question, when people do make up their minds, they come down now, as has been seen already today, on the sceptical side, the view that says that it will harm the Scottish economy. At the left-hand edge here is 2013, right-hand edge is 2014. The blue bits are those who say that independence would make the economy better. The red bit is those who would say that the economy would get worse with independence. And you can see that by 2014, almost regardless of education, people have a balance of red over blue. So on the whole, the problem for the Yes campaign is that people haven't been persuaded, as we've seen already today, about the benefits. But nevertheless, there is a kind of nugget of potential comfort for the Yes campaign in all this. Because one of the things that tends to happen when highly educated people are persuaded by the Yes campaign that the economy would benefit, they are more likely to translate that lesson into an intention to vote yes than those who have less education. You can see, I'll come back to the higher education educated people in a second, but if you look first at the group from upper secondary down to none, and these are the percentages intending to vote yes amongst those who expect independence to benefit the economy. And you can see that by 2014, the percentage intending to vote yes amongst those with an upper secondary education was 80% if they believed that the economy would benefit, whereas it was just about 65% amongst those who have low education. So in other words, people with more education in these 3 groups are more likely to translate a positive evaluation of the economic prospects into a yes vote than people with less education. Now, you might say, well, the higher education group's an exception here, but that's not really actually, because they actually also still have a higher group of undecideds, as we have seen already. And if you then squeeze them, to use the metaphor that we've employed several times today, you actually get there what they are inclined to do. You see the gradient actually showing up. So again, at the left-hand end, this is including people inclined to vote yes as well as definitely going to vote yes. These are people who think that the economy would benefit from independence. No fewer than 90% of the university-educated people there would vote yes, whereas it's only 75% amongst those who have no formal qualifications. So that's my third tipping point, one that hasn't happened, may never happen, but it's the only possible way in which the yes campaign could penetrate this group. If the yes side can persuade the well-educated people that the economy would benefit, that is a good investment of the yes campaign's time, because that will translate with almost certainty, with 90% certainty, into a yes vote. Whereas trying to do that with the people with less education who believe that the economy would benefit is, to some extent, more of a waste of time, because 25% of them will drift off into other things, such as voting no or not voting. Okay, let me then finish by summing up what I've got to say there. First of all, strong self-government, stronger self-government than Scotland currently has, now appeals more to the well-educated professional middle class than to other social groups. That's a tipping point that has passed, with enormous implications, probably long-term implications of the kind that will only become relevant after the 19th of September, if there is a no vote. The second point is that the no campaign has successfully captured the support of maximal devolutionists with minimal education. That's a tipping point that has probably been reached as a result of campaigning over the past year, possibly associated with Gordon Brown's frequent interventions pointing out that a large welfare state shares risks for the marginalised, but that's a speculation I would emphasise. And then thirdly, if the yes campaign is to achieve the final tipping point that it needs, then it might now concentrate its efforts on the well-educated maximal devolutionists, the maximal devolutionists who come to events of this kind. But a very last point is this: to appeal to the 40% of the electorate who are graduates, that would require a style of campaigning that is rather closer to the conversation going on in a room like today than to the haranguing that we heard on the television last Tuesday night.